presentation is entitled Cybersecurity, Your Privacy, and the Internet of Things. Rather than repeat what's in the brochure, since I'm looking at the cover of Time magazine from last week, where it says, it owns your data, it knows your friends, it has your credit cards, it hears your conversations, it follows you everywhere, and you can't go a day without it. So without mentioning any specific companies such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, I will note that on January 21st, France's data protection regulator, CNIL, found that Google's data collection practices were in breach of the EU's new privacy law. As far as Facebook, which I got a tour of last week, courtesy of my daughter who works there, so I won't trash that company too much, except to say I doubt that Mark Zuckerberg really meant that his company would weaponize social media to help elect the President of the United States, impact the British referendum, or incite genocide and ethnic cleansing in Southeast Asia. What is certain is that data breaches seem out of control. We can't control our own digital lives. Showing users only posts they agree with may be good for Facebook's bottom line, but it increases polarization, probably certainly harms democracy. A lie repeated a million times becomes the truth. Our data and everything we like and buy is turned around and sold to a data broker, to packages and sold to another broker. This is a shadow economy. And I won't even get to facial recognition, which perhaps Brian Ray will. Here to sort it all out is Professor Brian Ray from Cleveland State University. He's a professor of law. He has extensive experience in information governance, cybersecurity, and data privacy. He directs the Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy Protection. He received his BA from the University of Notre Dame. He received an MA in East Asian Studies, East Asian Languages from the University of Pennsylvania, and his JD from Ohio State University, where he was class valedictorian. His research focuses on security and privacy regulation. Then Attorney General Mike DeWine appointed him to the Cyber Ohio Advisory Board. And here is Professor Brian Ray. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. It's a tall order to say I'll sort it all out, which I won't do. And there's a ton of interesting stuff to talk about. John and I did a little preview discussion just yesterday to work through some of this. But what I'm going to focus on today is some work that we're doing at Cleveland Marshall across a couple different colleges. One of the nice things about the center that I direct is it's interdisciplinary, so I'm a lawyer. We work with the Urban College, we work with the Engineering College, and we work with our Business College, which has our MSIS program. And we're doing a project on facial recognition that I'll focus in on. But in the Q&A, I'll try to keep this short, and in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about any of the issues that John mentioned. And can't claim to be an expert in all of them, but they're all really, really interesting. So up here, I've got two logos for the two places that I'm sort of representing. The first is the Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy Protection at Cleveland Marshall, Cleveland State. The second down there, the Iot Collaborative, is a relatively new initiative that I'm part of. It's interdisciplinary, but also interinstitutional. Yes?
Let me ask you to slow down a little.
Sure, I'm sorry. Too much coffee this morning, I will. It's my most frequent comment on my student reviews is he talks too quickly. But the good news is I also talk circuitously, so I'll almost always say whatever I say at least twice. But I will slow down, sorry. Anyways, the Iot Collaborative is an interinstitutional collaborative between Cleveland State, Case Western Reserve, and it's funded by the Cleveland Foundation. And the objective of the group is really to make Cleveland a center for research and industry developments around IoT. And one of the things we decided from the very beginning, and the reason that I'm involved as a non-technologist, is security and privacy obviously need to be an essential component whenever you're doing a project related to IoT. And so what I'm going to focus on today is the privacy aspects of one particular set of technologies and applications within IoT, which is facial recognition. So these are just some nice graphics. We're in a world now where we think privacy is dead. I don't think that's completely true, but there's no question that our understandings of what privacy means and our default assumptions about what can be private and what should be private are being challenged in increasingly difficult ways by the technologies that are emerging, including facial recognition. These are a couple of different ways to define privacy, but one of the challenges we really have today is what are we going to consider to be private? How are we going to define it? In an analog world, which is how most of our existing laws still operate and still assume, it was relatively easy to think about what should maintain, what we will be able to maintain as private. Whereas now with new technologies coming online daily, there are those assumptions are being undermined and undermined frequently in ways that we're not seeing or we're not recognizing until it's too late, until something significant has happened and we realize, oh, wait a sec, all of this information is out there. One of the best recent examples is we probably all sort of understood that our cell phones have a GPS and that the towers functionally are tracking where we're at. Well, and we all sort of assumed that even though that capability was there, no way could it be available on the internet easily for about $500 that a private investigator could go down and track you as a specific individual, right? Well, that just news was broken by Motherboard, which is a fairly progressive, some would say aggressive tech media company, but they do a great job, and while they are a little edgy, they do a great job. They exposed this. One of their reporters actually went out and bought his own information and was able to track himself. And of course, this was embarrassing to the large telecom providers. It just prompted now congressional investigations. But it was surprising to me, and I'm a privacy and security researcher, to realize how easy it was to get access to that. What are you going to do about it? Well, are you going to stop using your cell phone? Are you going to shut it down? Probably not, right? You're going to hope that Congress, maybe the states, do something. Maybe the telecoms themselves get better. But as more and more of these things come online, these challenges are going to continue to get bigger. Okay, again, a couple of nice cartoons illustrating some of the dimensions of this. My favorite is on the bottom, Facebook telling Big Brother, you're an amateur. We've gotten much better at this. And we'll make some fun of Facebook, but the reality is Facebook is a great example of this phenomenon. How did Facebook start? Anybody remember? Yeah.
I think Mark Zuckerberg was in college and he decided to have a way of getting friends together.
Yeah.
People to know each other.
It was literally the Facebook. Remember the Facebooks? They still have them, although now they're almost always online. Well, okay, let's digitize. Probably didn't even have that term back then, but let's put it online. It was supposed to be purely internal for Harvard University, and then he had the smart idea, or maybe someone else did that he stole, allegedly. But the idea, hey, well, we could, this would be great because every college has a Facebook. We could sell this is going to be something internal for college students to do what they were already doing physically, which is to go through the Facebook, find people they wanted to connect with, do it online. That morphed in a way that I'm sure Zuckerberg never imagined. And in the early days, we thought of, hey, this is great. Everything should go up on the internet. This is a great way to communicate, a great way to connect. Now we can connect with our classmates from high school, from college, keep track of people, families can keep track of one another. No one was thinking about, even certainly not 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it just didn't seem that significant. And now we're all realizing, hey, we put our kids' photos up on the internet without their permission when they were young. Their entire lives are documented. Even if you're not on Facebook, you're on Facebook because someone's put a photo, someone you know has put your photo on there, and Facebook has been using algorithms that they are now scaling back, but using algorithms to identify you and prompt your friends to say, hey, do you know this person? Maybe you should invite them on. Again, not done in a deliberately devious way, certainly in an aggressive way to make money, but just not recognizing the privacy concerns yet.
Well, Facebook was also helped, enshrined put together by Davos constituents, whereas MySpace and other ones were not. And that's why Facebook was able to get so big.
Okay, so you know a little bit more about the specific
Davos,
history.
the people that go to the Davos
Yeah,
World
yeah.
Economic Forum.
They decided Facebook was gonna win.
Yes,
Mm.
and all the corporations backed them up and put their advertising on there now.
Well, that's what we get, you must know more about the history than I do. I don't know as much about the specifics, but either way, one way or the other, Facebook became the dominant. And of course, that's another dimension of this, right? Is it's a small handful of companies that are the dominant platforms because the network effect and the needs of the networked environment depend on scale. And so it tends to be the case that one or a handful of these companies emerge, whether it's by design or by the market. They tend to emerge as incredibly dominant, and they then try to use that dominance to increase it. All right, so turning to the specific topic I want to touch on today and the project we're working on at Cleveland State, facial recognition, surveillance, and privacy. So facial recognition technology has been around for a very long time. Ever since there's been cameras, there's been various technologies that analyze the footage that come on and try to make it better. Any of you use either Apple or Google or Amazon's not quite as good, but any of those to put your pictures online? You ever get those nice little things? Hey, look, here's what Google Photos has, or here's iPhone little memories. Have you ever used the facial recognition feature on any of them? Yeah, it's astonishing, right?
Yes.
I mean, it used to be pretty bad because I've got 4 kids, so I'm constantly looking for photos of them.
All you have to do is say, Siri, find me a picture of.
Yeah, well, and on your own photo collection, you put it in. You know, my 17-year-old daughter, I marked her the first time, and it was showing me photos where she, as a baby, is in the background. When I first looked at it, I was trying to figure out, well, where is she on this? And then I thought it was my younger daughter, but in fact, you know, and it's pretty astonishing how good the technology is. And of course, it has very useful applications, right? I now don't have to go through and individually identify my daughter. I periodically run these searches, and we've got them, right? So when she graduates next year and we have to do the senior embarrassing photos, no problem, right? I don't have to, you know, I just have to cull through the hundreds of photos that we have of her and pick the good ones. But the identification process is getting amazingly better. Now, when you think about that in the context of law enforcement, the good news is the current default, or for decades, because it's changing now, default way to use an image that of a potential suspect, either one pulled off of a security camera or or a picture description from someone eyewitness, was to go and take it and try to witnesses at the scene. Hey, do you know this person? Well, humans are really bad at doing that, and we want to be helpful, so we often will convince ourselves that, oh yeah, I think I do, yeah, I look at it looks like so and so, right? Lineups notoriously poor at this. Computers are not deliberately biased. We'll talk a little bit about their limitations and some bias based on the data, but they're not deliberately biased, and they're not going to make it up. They're not going to say, yes, I know that. They're going to, they're going to say, here's the best. And so they're incredibly objective about it. So as a tool, legitimate tool for law enforcement, it's actually much better than the current technologies that are out there. The challenge is the ubiquity and increasing ubiquity, which comes about from Internet of Things, and just the simple fact of how many cameras are out there, whether they're installed full-time as security cameras, as cameras that are tracking other things like traffic, or just our own phones, right, that are out there. So the ubiquity of it means that what used to be a limited tool, you were lucky if you had a actual face that you could pull off of a security camera, or a picture, or a witness who could create a picture, now means that, hey, we've got pictures all over the place, and we can go back in time, and we've got massive databases that can pull. And so in the law enforcement context, it's now de facto the case, and it's true in Ohio, that if you have a driver's license, your photo from that driver's license is in a database, and is in a database that, with some protections, and we'll talk a little bit about those, anytime that there's a potential suspect, the photos run across the entire database, which includes anybody who's got a driver's license, right? And then, in fact, the FBI has agreements with most states, and they have a much larger database of photos that come from other sources. And so it's what Georgetown has a project on this calls the perpetual lineup, right? And so that's one of the issues is the ubiquity of this and the fact that now with all of these technologies out there, law enforcement and the government more broadly is able to now conduct searches across everyone. And again, if it's a legitimate lead, if there's a legitimate law enforcement, if there's been a legitimate incident where law enforcement is looking for someone who's responsible for a criminal act, it doesn't seem like it's such a bad idea, but it doesn't take very much to think about the more nefarious ways that technology can be used. As I was driving in this morning on NPR, there was a piece about Project Raven, a group of former NSA cybersecurity experts who were hired by the UAE, were told that, hey, no, this is kind of, even though you guys are retired, this is actually sanctioned by the US government, and it turned out they ended up targeting private citizens using Facebook and others. Basically anybody who the very paranoid UAE government felt might be a threat to them, you know, they were asked to go and target. And of course these kind of technologies and the ubiquity of pictures allows that. I'm not sure if are we hooked up? Let me see. I forgot to ask if we're on internet. But if not, I'll send this link out. And this is a screenshot from one of the leading Chinese facial recognition companies. And actually, rather than take the time out, I'll send this link out and you guys can look at it. But it's a screenshot and it's real-time video analytics. So this is the next phase. Right now, most of the technologies, they take a static image that's pulled from a camera, and then they go look for a match. And it's actually, the technology is actually more limited than you might think, although it's getting better and better. This technology at least purports to be able, in real time, to identify, and it very unabashedly shows the capacity with live footage. It's identifying individual people, it's either identifying them by name or identifying them by sort of category, because using artificial intelligence, they're beginning to identify what's going on.
I looked that up in 2009, 10 years ago, and they had the capability then to pick out faces out of the crowd because of sports event and be able to identify.
Well, this is one of the interesting aspects of it is frequently the vendors claim capabilities that are actually more limited. And we know for a fact that real time, it's getting better and better, but it's still fairly limited. Certainly in 2009, if they did it, it wasn't nearly as good as they were claiming. But it's not just the Chinese. Amazon, which chose, and I think this was, someone did a really, really bad job of marketing their facial recognition system. They call it recognition with a K, which at least to my ear sounds even more ominous. They should call it, face happy or something, I don't know. And they've been aggressively marketing to law enforcement. And again, if you read their copy, which I've put up here, they're emphasizing they're emphasizing business use cases. Make it easier for your customers to identify faces, make it easier for you to identify faces, and then they sort of bury at the very end, you can detect, analyze, and compare faces for a variety of user verification, people counting, and public safety use cases. Now we know for a fact, and they've gotten in some hot water, including by their own employees, for marketing this both for national security and also for law enforcement. But one of and again, I'll send this link out. In the video in the link, they announce that they now have this real-time video capability, right? And the issue there again is the ability now to use security cameras at a live event to actually scan in real time and identify who's there at that time, as opposed to now, which predominantly you're looking backwards. You're taking a capture and then you're going to have to go try to track someone after the fact. Okay, and it's not just law enforcement. It's just not just companies. Schools, there's a big industry, and these tend to be the smaller players who aren't out there and getting a lot of attention. They're taking advantage of the violence that's been happening in schools, and many school systems are unreflectively adopting these systems, which essentially scan everybody that's coming in and out. And again, the motivation is good, right? We want to protect our kids. We want to make sure we know who's in schools, and there's good reasons to make sure we know who's in schools. I now have to sign in and out every time I go pick up my daughter's tuba, even though I'm just gonna go 5 feet into the band room and get the tuba, right? I don't mind that, I don't mind having to say I'm in or out. But now we're talking about kids, and we're talking about putting their faces daily onto a system. And the quote on the bottom is sort of the point of privacy issues Matt's added. I don't hear them raised. Safety and security trump those concerns. So again, the issue is not that the technology in and of itself doesn't have good uses and there aren't ways that we might want to deploy it. It's the lack of careful thought and reflection on how to deal with these issues that we don't have good answers to yet, but we need to start thinking about them. This is from the ACLU's website. They've got a great set of resources that explain and identify the various surveillance technologies that are out there. Biometric technologies, which facial recognition is part of, they describe in some detail some of the concerns. But one of the other concerns is that there are real limitations to this. And one of the limitations is that the databases tend primarily to be white males. And so there's been some really prominent examples where the facial recognition technology actually doesn't work that well for women or minorities. And this, on the one hand, you think, well, you know, why is that a problem? Now I'm not being surveilled from a privacy perspective. Maybe that's helpful, except that you can get false positives because it's not that good. And if you've got government officials or law enforcement or national security who aren't trained in how to recognize what is a true positive and what the limitations are, you can get it used in ways that cause the same kind of mistakes, only now with the added concern that people are thinking the technology is better than humans. But more importantly, there are applications that are currently coming online. For example, Delta in Detroit has a pilot where you use your face to get on to the plane. You don't need the device. And increasingly, actually Cleveland Clinic, when I went in the other day, they said, oh, do you want your picture permanently stored? We'll let you use your picture to check in. I said, no, thank you. So now I'm listed as. And I feel I'm going to regret that, right? Because now I still have to go through what's supposed to be easier kiosk, but in fact, you know, it takes 5 minutes to get in. And so increasingly, you're not going to be able to get access because default, we're going to start using these things. This is a study, the website's gendershades.org. It's research by an MIT researcher who started this as an undergraduate or as a graduate student, where her face, she found, was not recognized by the major facial recognition platforms. You can go in and see and use their little demo, and she wasn't recognized until she put a white mask on, and then it recognized her. And so she did a whole project. She did her graduate thesis on this, and then she's followed up. And these are the statistics. Now, Microsoft Face++, which is a Chinese company, and IBM, have responded, and they claim that they're improving their databases. But these were the original gaps. Okay, this is one of my favorite quotes. So facial recognition technology is finally more accurate. It's getting better. Could that be used against immigrants? And Professor Nelson's tweet is my favorite. We must stop confusing, quote, inclusion in more, quote, diverse surveillance systems with justice and equality, right? So even if we overcome these technological limitations, even if we create the perfect database where every face is identified, well, that's arguably, in many ways, more problematic, right? The underlying issue here is privacy and government surveillance. Along the way, we're recognizing that there are discriminatory aspects about the technology itself. More concerning, actually, are the algorithms that are used to process other kinds of information to make predictions around things like whether you're going to get bail, and then on the civil side, whether you'll get credit and things like that. Those have real deep effects. On the facial recognition, it gets better, but getting better doesn't solve the problem. Okay, so there are a couple things going on. I'm not going to trash the big companies completely. There is a growing recognition. I mean, I really think we're at a point where, as a society, we finally decided, hey, this is a problem that needs dealing with. We don't have good answers, but interestingly, we're seeing companies, and Apple was at the forefront of this in many ways, but companies trying to position themselves from a market perspective as privacy protected. Facebook's still kind of late to the game, and they keep getting exposed for the really egregious stuff they're doing. but they're pushing, and they've been forced to push it because of the public embarrassment. Microsoft on facial recognition specifically came out a couple months ago with a set of principles that they're pushing. And the principles, you know, they make a lot of sense. Now what they want is, they want federal, comprehensive federal regulation on this so that they don't have to deal with individual states, which that's a different debate. But at least we're seeing companies begin to talk about this as something that needs a solution and something that they themselves need to be doing something about. The other interesting phenomenon that's been going on, and it's been focused on the West Coast, although Boston, there's been some efforts there, and this is now what we're specifically hoping to start to do here in Northeast Ohio. They've passed local ordinances, and it's what one academic researcher has called privacy localism. The idea that in the United States, as opposed to Europe, because we lack a comprehensive federal privacy legislation, and there are pieces that regulate healthcare information, and the FTC has some authority to do certain things that they've been trying to expand. But what we've seen is some grassroots efforts in reaction to some really high-profile, sort of thoughtless efforts to expand surveillance. A set of ordinances that have come online to say, hey, you know what, we need to have more control over this. There needs to be more specific engagement with communities, and especially affected communities, around whether we're going to adopt these technologies and how they're going to work. And so Seattle's in the process now of implementing their 2017 ordinance. Oakland is about a year and a half into it. Santa Clara County has a similar one. Okay, and so what we're doing at Cleveland State as part of this interdisciplinary workshop is we're going to bring the chief privacy officer from Seattle. We're bringing 2 of the Oakland privacy commissioners. We're actually hoping to get a representative from Microsoft, but we've got the head of the FBI's biometric division and the DHS biometric division. We're holding a workshop on March 29th where we're going to just have a conversation about how we should be approaching these issues, and in particular, how should local communities, state and local law enforcement, what are the best practices that are out there around using facial recognition for law enforcement purposes, for civilian purposes, and most importantly, we're going to learn about what Seattle and Oakland have done to engage communities, in which they've done a fairly extensive effort, both on facial recognition technology and in Seattle more broadly on what we call open data, which the idea is government is collecting data about individuals and government functions for that. It ought to be as transparent about how it does it, but it also ought to, with proper privacy protections, allow access to that data to the public so that they can figure out creative ways to solve problems that they're seeing, but at the same time we've got to figure out how to protect privacy. And Seattle's done a lot of great work in that. So I tried to talk slower, but I think I still talk too fast. But anyways, that's a quick overview of these issues and what we're doing. And I'd be happy to answer questions about this stuff or any of the stuff that John mentioned at the beginning.
Okay, just a brief break here. Thank you so much.
Sure.
It's now time. Oh, sorry. It's now time for the official question and answer session for this talk, and I'm going to pass out these clipboards here. And if you are not on our email list to get reminders of upcoming forums, please give us your name and email list, and we'll put you on the list officially. One other comment, please keep your questions short, and the people holding the microphones will choose the question, because we have not security issues, but we want to make sure we can get this properly recorded. So they will choose the actual people that get to ask the questions. So thank you. I'm going to pass these around.
First question. Make sure you hold it right. Yes, thank you so much, and it's reassuring to hear that you're working on this community issue, because many of us who are activists, we would like to know how we may be protected for free speech and civil disobedience. I would say that in 2002, when many of us were in the Northeast Ohio Anti-War Coalition, we were infiltrated by a Cleveland police woman, probably directed by the FBI to try to infiltrate us. And we got onto that. And then I just read an article in the Guardian that the FBI has targeted BAN on the West Coast, which is a national organization. This was a group that was demonstrating against a Nazi demonstration, and it was the FBI targeting the anti-fascists who were peaceful rather than the fascist group. So it's very worrisome because the FBI obviously has a history of targeting left-wing and activist groups.
Right, and so that's always the challenge, right? And the major concern here is we know that government and in particular security services, there's always the potential for abuse, and there's been a history of abuse. So how do you gain sufficient transparency that still allows them to do the important work that they do, trying to uncover legitimate criminal activity and the legitimate aspect of national security. The initiatives that I spoke about primarily are operating at the local level, but the hope is there's clear conversations and clear connections with the FBI. And so one thing I know that is happening that's helpful, it doesn't directly address your concern, but it's helpful, is that the FBI is actually, so right now, the FBI has a massive database that is much larger than any individual states, and they have access to other states. And they allow state and local law enforcement divisions to access that database. And the protocols and procedures, I don't know the complete details, but they're not as robust as they could be. And they are moving to a position where you have to have a trained examiner, someone who's gone through, there's a state standard organization called FISWIG, that, again, this doesn't address directly your issues, but at least from a qualitative perspective, they understand how the technology works, they understand what level of detail and quality a picture needs to be to actually legitimately run on it. And so the FBI is going to, in the future, require that hey, if you want to use our database, you at least have to have that. Again, whether that will then prevent them from running searches illegitimately, that's another set of issues. But the fact that the privacy localism phenomenon is helping to drive attention to this, and of course that's what you need to do, right? You need to just get people organized and instead of, what I often hear is, oh, well, kids these days are growing up with their pictures on Facebook, they're not going to care. I don't think that's true. In fact, I know it's not true. I talk to my kids about it. And when you educate people about this, it's a matter of making it salient for them. Then they do care, right? They do understand the implications of this. And even though they recognize it's going to be more challenging for them, they still want to have some control.
Hello, Brian.
Hey.
Hold by your mouth.
Hello. Yes, as a matter of American constitutional law, what prescriptions are there on FedGov and even StateGov massive databasing and data mining in the 1st, 4th, and 9th, and 10th Amendments?
There are several, but it's in flux. I mean, this is the one of the one of my students is working on license plate, doing a paper on license plate readers, which is going to come up in front of the Supreme Court. And so First Amendment context, as you mentioned, the concern is obviously the government prohibiting individuals and groups from getting together and expressing using their right, which is free speech, to say things that the government might not like, right? And that's a little easier, it's a little more obvious in many instances when that's happening. Fourth Amendment, the real questions, there's serious questions and really still a lot of uncertainty, an uncertainty that's going to get settled by judges that probably don't understand these technologies very well, which is another issue that sort of is down the line for our center. We're thinking about ways to educate judges about this stuff. We're still working it out. I mean, the license plate readers issue is an interesting one. There was a good, privacy protective decision on GPS technology, the extent to which you can do that. The issue with license plate readers is you're being captured by these cameras constantly, and if the data is kept, then you can go back in time and search and see, right? Well, license plate reader is a little bit different than a GPS tracker, right? Because your license plate is out there and it's public and it's there specifically so that we can identify your vehicle for a variety of things, including law enforcement purposes. And so how that plays out, what the NSA is doing, that's a whole, another set of issues that it's pretty clear that what they were doing for a very long time crossed a lot of constitutional and direct statutory lines. But how much they can do to collect data and analyze it even absent, or what level of concern they need under the Patriot Act, and how well that system of checks and balances is working is, we're figuring that out still. So that wasn't a very good answer, I don't think, but you asked a big question.
In the flux.
There we go.
Thank you.
There appears to be a burgeoning market for governments to develop surveillance programs. How about a market for individuals to develop our surveillance programs? Because I know the government is interested in my tax returns. I'm interested in Trump's tax returns. And are there models out there for individuals to be able to exact surveillance on governments,
it's an excellent point, and it connects back to the reference I made at the very end to the open data issue, right? So the flip side of the coin is open data, right? Aggregation of data, tracking data, provides a tool for transparency and accountability, right? For citizens to hold governments accountable. And so that's a powerful and important tool, and the open data movement is designed to say, hey, look, government ought to keep everything open, right? We ought to be able to access it. Let's find out what individual government officials are, how they're spending taxpayer money, what they're doing, and let's get access to it. Now, the privacy concerns, of course, cut on the flip side, because what is the data that government's accessing? Well, seems relatively unproblematic to be able to track expenses when someone's filing expense report and asking for government reimbursement for government activities, right? But government's aggregating data about everybody, right? So take the license plate readers. To what extent do we want anybody to go be able to access years worth of license plate reader data, right? You can imagine the issues there. You figure out who your ex-spouse's license plate was. You figure out where she went, and this is increasingly a problem. So there are possibilities, but also the concerns are still there, and how to balance that, we're still figuring out.
I just want to be able to look into Trump's irises and see if he's telling the truth. Simple little program.
Don't have to look into his iris. The Russians have been putting the bomb in his head.
Well, I can't speak to that one, but I'm sure someone's working on it.
With all the data recognition, if a person has been able to not have their face photographed and their license plate looked at and so forth, what about voice recognition? Is that considered an important priority for gathering data, or is it just way out there and not important because the facial is easier, or some other information is more available?
I don't know as much about voice recognition, but there's no question that a variety of biometric signatures, there are researchers looking at how to use those, because of course one of the issues with the face right now is you often don't get a good image or capture. So gait recognition is one that's out there. I'm trying to recall, I think it was the New York Times, that there was an article just the other day about a large scale, and I don't remember where it was, but in one prison system, might have been state or federal, there's been a long-term surveillance operation where they were recording inmates' voices and using voice recognition so that they could keep track of who's doing what and what they were saying when they were on the phone, and also because they do get sound throughout the institution, you know, being able to figure out who's doing what where and where they are. So certainly the capability's out there. I suspect the reason face gets more attention is because, of course, voice recognition, there's just not as much of it, right? And for these things to work, the algorithms to work well, the key is large amounts of data so that they can begin to identify patterns.
Someone wearing a burqa where the face would not be available.
Right, you know, that's one.
What did you say, Sue? If someone was wearing a burqa, the face would not be available.
They go to
And I'm
gate-
also
gate
thinking
recognition.
about women, you said the women's facial characteristics and minorities.
There's a mic.
I'm thinking that, women's facial, you said facial characteristics are not as readily available with women or minorities. And is that really an issue that is being worked on? I'm just questioning, I don't know.
Yeah.
4K cameras.
Well, so the issue there is that the databases used to train these systems had many more white male images than images of people from minority communities or women, and so they were just much better. The technology has the capability to be as good with any any subset of humanity, and for that matter, animals and other things, and they're getting better at it. But so that's an issue that eventually we'll get past. The technology will clearly get better at it. And then the other thing that they're getting better is they're getting better at identifying lesser quality images, being able to track lesser quality images. But there's no question they're beginning to get more comprehensive. So eyes, I think you mentioned Trump's iris detection. I mean, that's for security purposes and for identification purposes. Like the iris is really good. It's much more distinct. But of course, you got to get pretty close. But there's no question they're expanding the capability of different pieces of biometric information to be used to identify individuals.
Can photographs taken with an iPhone, for example, be considered good quality enough for all of these data purposes and facial recognition?
Depending on the context, but yeah, like in good lighting, you know, if I took a picture of you right now, as I understand it, that'd be a pretty good picture to match. The harder ones and the ones you get more often are pulling screenshots off of a lower resolution surveillance camera, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which where you're dealing with the moving image. I don't know who's doing who's got the mic.
It looks like everybody's going to be wearing face masks in the near future. But my question is it a reasonable expectation to assume that you have privacy these days?
So I would turn the question around and say what we need to figure out and what these efforts in Seattle and Oakland and other places are trying to do is help to decide as a community where those lines are, right? The technology has the capability already to do things that most of us would find objectionable. And there are both private companies and governments who are doing things that certainly we would find objectionable. And so where we're at now is we're not going to be able to stop that, and the technology is going to evolve, but we need to begin to at least have a conversation and decide, hey, these are lines that we want right now. And then of course the challenge is enforcing them. But at least we're not even there yet, right? We haven't even really identified, and the revelations that are coming out about Facebook and Google and others are a result of the fact that we haven't had those conversations yet because people weren't aware, and of course it wasn't in the private industry's interest to make people aware and to have those conversations.
But the objection is mostly when it's applied to me, if you apply it to somebody else, that's fine. So,
well, I'm not so sure that most people would feel that way. It's more that, as illustrated by the quote with respect to schools, hey, if you're talking about my kid's safety, I don't care, right? Like, I don't care, many people would say. Let's track, and they're not they're either not fully aware or they're not thinking through the implications of hundreds of hours of footage or thousands of hours of footage of their child growing up, you know, being available and whether there are sufficient protections around what that might mean for them, you know, later in their life.
I find that I have much more difficulty recognizing women than men. Some might say it's just my male biases, but I suspect it's partially due to the fact that women can change their appearance much more readily than men tend to do. Just by changing your hairdo or your hair
How
color.
about beards?
Well, I was getting there. But the question, I do have a question there on the street. How easy is it to fool facial recognition detection systems by making minor changes like a hairdo or a beard or makeup?
So, I'm not as expert on the tech specifics, because I do the regulatory side. But as I understand it, hair doesn't really matter, and beards don't matter because the technology is focused on the facial structure itself.
Data points on the face.
Right. It builds, you know, to the extent possible, 3D image of it. But there are techniques that can change how the light hits your face, and so there's a product that someone came up with it's basically really elaborate makeup that will allow you to, in essence, it's more about how the light hits your face as opposed to what we as humans perceive as characteristics that would foil our ability to see if someone changed their hair or grew a beard or had regular makeup. So there are. I had this pretty funny quote that I put up on my door for my students. This guy, he went deep into how to stay as private as possible. One thing you do is you create a series of nested LLCs in Montana to do any business with anybody, and then you move from your current address so they don't know where you're. But then he goes down the line. He says, "Well, facial recognition is a real problem," and then he said, "Well, you could wear a mask, but that tends to draw attention in and of itself, right? Through privacy." And then for night vision cameras, you can use sort of infrared to foil that, but for the day cameras, you can't. So it's the bottom line is getting better and better. And the real issue for the cameras is, again, on gender is it's on the programs. It's really the more limited data.
Aren't we really fighting a losing battle trying to protect privacy? There is an article in this month's Scientific American that describes how facial characteristics are digitized, and then how the true facial characteristics are then reconstructed from the digitized version. Now, forget government for a moment, but these techniques will eventually, and not so long from now, be available on the internet. And recognizing that Seattle and Oakland is trying to do a good job in protecting their populations, a lot of it is online. I could do the searching and reconstruct from somebody else that's in Russia. How can you protect it in the long term?
So, no question. We're in a challenging era, and an era where the technology doesn't give us real choice and control. My perspective on that is, well, we need to try to figure it out and get some guidelines. I mean, there are some things you can do as an individual, right? You can limit your presence online. You can not. There are obviously costs to that, right? You cannot use social media. I don't use Facebook. I use LinkedIn though for professional groups, right? Because there's a need And increasingly, you know, you get pressure from the dean, well, come on, you gotta be on Twitter, you gotta be on Facebook, we need to get the word out, you know. You're speaking at the Unitarian Church, come on, you should be tweeting it out, and post some pictures, by the way. And so that, you know, these things, there's real challenges. But, you know, there are ways that you can attempt to minimize to an extent and reassert some control. One of the biggest ones is check your apps. Go into the settings, figure out which apps. By default, almost every app wants your location data. You don't need to do that, right? You don't, and you shouldn't be doing that. You can limit the ability of some of these apps to share your data. And of course, if you're going to use the Maps app, right, it's got to have your location when it's using it, but you can limit it to using that. So there are some ways you can make modest steps, and the hope is that if we begin to pay closer attention instead of just sort of throwing up our hands, that we will get to a point where we're at least having some lines, right, and some lines that are being respected. Europe is way ahead on this. They've got the General Data Protection Regulation, which, if it's applied to the strict letter, it will be a disaster, because it's going to be almost impossible to do exactly what it says in many respects things ought to do. So we're gonna reach a point where there will be interpretations, and there'll be conventional settlements around what it exactly means, but the starting point of it is, hey, you ought to have control. And of course that's founded in Europe's history in the fact that their constitutional systems and the European Union adopted an explicit individual privacy right that doesn't just affect government surveillance and government law enforcement, but reaches into private relationships as well. And that's, you know, that's a result of the very awful things that happened in World War II. Whereas in the United States, we're relying on a very, very old constitution and an attempt to kind of read between the lines and extend the Fourth Amendment or the First Amendment in some respects. And we don't have that explicit right, and we don't have that sort of history.
So going back to some of these global efforts, do any of them contain anything in terms of restrictions or penalties for not properly securing the data that is collected? Because we've all heard about, you know, like the FBI agent who was looking up his ex-wife in all of those databases, or databases that have been put on public web servers so that anyone can access them. Are there any penalties for not actually securing the systems? So, two points there. First, one distinction I didn't draw at the beginning is security and privacy overlap, and in many cases they work in the same direction, but they are distinct. And to your first point, in terms of having security, that is of course one of the foundational aspects of privacy. If you're going to collect data, you've got to try to make sure there's not unauthorized access, and that could be security in the sense of an external malicious actor trying to penetrate, or as you described it, internal policies around access control and legitimate use, right? And that's one of the big efforts, particularly in law enforcement specific use of the databases, is making sure, A, that there's a quality procedure and trained professionals who understand the limitations of the technology, and when there is a investigative lead and based on a match, but also around access. And Ohio got into big trouble with their data. So when they first put the driver's license online, it was the case that, because it's this broader shared technology system, that, as I understand it, government officials could just access it and run searches, and I think there was some examples. So that's part of it as well. In terms of these particular local efforts, they're really focused not on sanctions per se, but on best practices and procedures, and procedures that engage the community around, okay, here's what we're thinking about doing. All right, we're thinking about installing IoT, internet-connected cameras on the light posts because, you know, in these areas, because they're hotspots for crime. Here are the capabilities of the technology. Here are the other things we're thinking about doing with it. And then having a conversation around that, and, you know, raising issues like, well, hold on, why are you picking those spots? That's problematic. Those are in minority communities. Sure, your data shows they're crime hotspots, but now you're going to be, you know, discriminatorily collecting data that can be retrospectively viewed and used for other purposes in minority communities and not white communities. Is that legitimate? Should there be some way, some other criteria, or should we deploy these cameras more broadly? But
it's more around those conversations as opposed to specific sanctions. But part of it is access control and policies, and actually we're hoping to get from Seattle pretty soon a sort of download of a range of their, the specifics. We have the ordinance itself, which just prescribes this process, but how exactly they're implementing it. You know, it may include sanctions or at least, you know, disciplinary issues, but I don't know the specifics yet.
Yes, over at Michigan State University in East Lansing, several years ago, they started to and finished the development of databases, search that takes the victim sketches, part of stew of potential suspects, and they can match them up now with the mugshots and do the search and come up with a list of suspects. What do you think about that, particularly in terms that the president of Eastern Michigan just resigned last month over protecting the privacy of Larry Nassar?
So I'm not familiar with that specific program. I do know that the Michigan State Police are one of the more progressive and have one of the more robust programs for they call it SNAP, their biometric program. We're actually bringing in one of their technicians for this program. So it was Georgetown actually that told us, hey, should we talk to Michigan, because they're doing a relatively better job. I'm not sure, it sounds like that might be interface with what they're doing, but I don't know the specifics of what's going on.
They've been big in facial recognition for a long time.
Is there any movement that you see at the national level in Congress to pass legislation for this privacy protection? I have read that the Congress, most of the members who are older are woefully ignorant about modern technology, so we need a lot of help.
So the short answer is yes, and there's been a lot more activity just over the last year. And the interesting thing about privacy is it straddles the political divide. So there are privacy hawks on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, and there's general agreement across the board. No one is saying, hey, we don't need to do something about this. That these almost daily, certainly weekly revelations about privacy violations and or privacy mistakes, and Apple just had the big one with FaceTime, require some more significant effort. The real challenge around so there's consensus around that, and of course the devil's always in the details, but the broad outlines of things we might do, there are a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit that people would agree on. The real challenge is whether there'll be preemption or not. And I've talked to some of the attorneys at FTC, because I said, hey, I'm reading the transcripts of these hearings, it sounds like Republicans and Democrats are agreeing, and the FTC is agreeing, hey, the FTC needs more authority to do things. And the real issue is the companies, and Microsoft, the piece they're pushing for facial recognition. They want a national regulation, and they say, hey, we've gotten burned in other things where we've had technologies that were out there, and then later on, we get into hot water because regulations. We want to know, we want clarity, but what they want is clarity that's universal and comprehensive. They don't want California to be, because California's got this new law that's very aggressive. They don't want to have to deal with California's law versus the federal version. And so that's what is hanging up politically, the ability to compromise. So there's definite recognition and there's opportunity. The question is whether you get over the hurdle of having a single comprehensive federal one, which would almost certainly be probably less aggressive than what California's done, or whether you have federal legislation on top of state.
Isn't it also a problem that technology is moving so rapidly that any laws will be out of date?
That's always an issue, although when you look at what GDPR has done, one way to at least address in part that concern is around principles, right? You sort of have broader principles. And this is always true of legislation. The legislation doesn't specifically address one type of technology. It's more around, hey, if you're going to collect, here are the things that here's what you've got to do before you collect it, and then here are the rights that individuals have with respect to the data, once you've collected it. And right now, the default in the US is you sign a privacy policy that basically, in most instances, says, hey, I'm gonna collect your data, and here are all the things I'm gonna do with it. And either you say yes or you say no. And what the GDPR and to some extent the California approach does is say, well, hold on, you can't force people to say in perpetuity yes to certain things. You're gonna have to allow them to revoke that consent and either pull your data, certain aspects of your data completely, or at least have some control over what happens subsequently. And again, that's not easy to do. It's not as if there's an easy answer, because the way the system works is, they aggregate, they collect the data, they aggregate it, they sell it, and in many cases they do legitimately try to anonymize it. And what GDPR does to an extent is allow you to say, hey, you get to unravel that, that string that's been pulled so far out, and that's not technically an easy thing to do.
One more question, tops.
Somebody else? Is there another one? If not, I'll answer the question.
Okay.
I worked for over 20 years with a guy at Case Western Reserve, and he moved on to Washington, I moved on to NASA. And one day at lunch at NASA, there was a guy that was a dead ringer, absolute doppelganger, and could have, I actually thought it was my friend that I've known for 20 years. And I showed him the picture and he said, this is really spooky. And so there always will be cases of mistaken identity. Are there legal precedents for, and there already have been obviously in the past, eyewitness accounts that were the wrong identity? Will the cyber identifications be given more weight than a human account, or do you think they'll be less likely or more likely to be believed? I guess that's the question.
So two parts for it. No question, one of the big risks here is we tend to trust technology, right? And so already, ever since the advent of video, there have been evidentiary rules developed to try to limit the use of it because it's so compelling, and authenticate. There's huge authentication issues. The whole set of issues we didn't touch on around what they call deep fake technology, right? Which is out there and getting better and better, where if you Google it, you can see some really stunning examples where they can now alter video with someone else's face and make it look like, and then add the audio on and make it look like this person. So there's a comedian used President Obama and had him like swearing, and one of the issues there was that you could tell if you paid attention to the blink rate, because the deepfakes weren't blinking. Now they're mimicking the blinking, and so that's no question. There's a huge issue around authentication, and I don't know the details, but I listened to a really good piece with a researcher who's been used by news media authorities, because of course when they get pictures from places of conflict or authoritarian regimes where there's a claim something's happened, they need to authenticate, right? But certainly that's an issue that's coming on significantly. The protections right now, certainly specifically law enforcement, are the best practice that, as I understand it, most law enforcement agencies use, but it's one of these issues, is when you get a match, when you get a picture that then there's a match on the database, it is limited to what they call an investigative lead. So what does that mean? Well, it's a little bit amorphous, but it at a minimum means right now you can't, for example, get a search warrant based merely on an investigative lead. There's got to be something else confirming it. But those are the issues that are coming online. In fact, we talked to the head of the Michigan Biometrics Division, and she said one of the things they're waiting for is they haven't yet been called into a trial where their match has been led to an arrest and an indictment, and to see sort of how that might be challenged and what issues might come around it. I do know there's also good work being done and research being funded for defense attorneys to be able to be educated around how these technologies are used and when that's the other issue, is when they're being used. Because law enforcement, and now we're getting more broadly, but the stingray technologies, the fake cell tower capture technologies, there's a funded effort to train defense attorneys to recognize when those don't always get disclosed, and it's the subsequent evidence that gets disclosed, and how they can see through the evidence that doesn't get disclosed that, hey, I bet a stingray was being used, and then probe that, because then then the question becomes whether the stinger was used legitimately, whether they had a warrant, but,
What
there,
is
so.
a Stingray?
So the Stingray is a mobile, it basically mimics a cell phone. And so it allows you to do more direct surveillance on someone who you suspect might be engaged in criminal activity before you have enough evidence to go get a warrant to actually pull the real cell phone tower records.
Well, Professor Ake, thank you, that was excellent, not at all reassuring. This is homework. There is a service today. The worship team would like to present you with a new order of service. It looks a little different from what you've been used to. Hope you like it. In 2 weeks, the forum will discuss the European Union, disunited or in transition. Speaker will be Kenneth Ledford, Case Western Reserve Associate Professor of History and Law. And for those of you who want more details, there are brochures on the table, which I hope you will pick up on the way out. Thank you all for coming. Breakfast next Sunday. Oh, and there's a, first Sunday potluck this afternoon. Okay, covered it.